All right, loves. That's how I started. That's how I started. If you'd be so kind to give me your attention, I would deeply be in gratitude to you. Speaking of attention, when I used to work in like classrooms in Detroit, I learned really deeply that people's attention is this beautiful gift. And so when you decide to give it to someone, when you have a conversation or when you decide to like ask for their attention, I think it's really beautiful to accept it as a gift. So thank y'all for your attention. And as we get ready to close with our last panel, I hope that you made the connections that you need to make. If you didn't, the day is not over. Don't forget. Speaking of the day not being over, the booth where you came in also has Metaspore swag. So considering the fact that it's not over, feel free to come through, participate, support the project if that's your thing. I just wanted to let y'all know that. We'll have this last panel and then a closing. I'm going to turn it over to Nicolas and this wonderful collection of humans. Last panel, memory. Nicolas.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I couldn't be here earlier because of all my stuff I'm doing, grading midterms and craziness at Berkeley, so I apologize, but I was able to see Jeremy's amazing performance, and that was really something, so thank you for that. Yeah, so memory. I guess I got to talk about my own intellectual genealogy a bit, right? So I am White Mountain Apache, as the program says, from East Central Arizona. And my path to that area of anthropology, which is where I'm doing right now at Berkeley, is kind of interesting, I guess. I mean, it all goes back to kind of looking at the structure of Western knowledge and trying to really decolonize and indigenize, those forms of knowledge in reference to how I am as an Inde Apache person. And so I embrace a lot of sovereignty-driven research. I embrace a lot of kind of inclusive research, of course, and then kind of looking at the bigger picture of how I really bridge the gap between knowledge systems, between the Western knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and how I just put my knowledge forth as empirical, right? As truth-based as much as Western empirical systems, right? And so that's what I try to do at Berkeley, basically. And so when the topic of memory comes up, and when Annika invited me to be the moderator here, that's not really spoke to me, I think, in reference to how I think about the past and the present and the future of everybody in the world in a lot of ways. Right now I'm doing a big boarding school project on my reservation, and it's really been, it's hard sometimes to hear those stories about intergenerational trauma, and how the hurt is still ongoing, but at the same time, there's other stories there that are filled with, I guess, friendship and goodness and kind of the better things that were happening in those contexts, in terms of like, I don't sleep on the ground anymore, I got 3 meals a day, those types of things. And so the memories from these elders right now are really pervasive in my mindset, in a sense. And so I think about that a lot in terms of relationality, I guess. And so for me, that's something that's really important in terms of foregrounding oral tradition, oral histories as, something very much needed to dismantle kind of the ways we look at the world these days. And so with these amazing, panelists up here that I'm here to talk to you about their own research, I don't think I can do them justice by reading verbatim their bios. So I'm hoping they can talk to their stuff a little bit. We have 10 minutes, right? So before we get into the big stuff. So they can kind of just talk to their own kind of, bios and where they come from. Is that cool? Thank you.
Are you moving along?
Yes.
Cool.
Sorry.
Would you like me to start?
Yes, please.
Cool.
Please,
Hi.
Stephanie. Yes.
Hey everyone, Stephanie Dinkins. What am I? Today, I'm gonna start with I'm human, and I feel like I need to start with that today, just human. I'm an artist who's been looking at artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, really oral histories in certain ways, and trying to figure out what that means for the future, which implies the past and all the times in between, right? And how we put that together. And I'm really invested in the ways that we make a world. Like, I feel like we're rebuilding, reoriented, recrafting a world right now and have a lot of opportunity space in it. And I'm like, how do you take advantage of that opportunity space? What do you do with it, right? What things do we call out? What things do we do? What things do we model? What things do we make? And those are the things that are really important to me, and I will leave it there. No.
Beautiful. Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, I'm Kriti Sharma. I'll say I'm a person, and I actually feel very, speaking of relationality, like, I guess one of the first things I'll say about me is that it was friendship that brought me here, that like I have a friend whose name is Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and this is why, and I brought all of her books because this is how I met Annika, was through a conversation that Alexis and I had. She's an amazing Black feminist poet who wrote Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons for Marine Mammals, M Archive, a lot of love for Alexis's work here. Dub, Finding Ceremony, and somehow that's just kind of what's coming up, is like we talked about not being a single person, and right now I really feel like someone who is kind of sitting here as like partly a symbiont in a way with someone else who couldn't be here in person. But I wanted to really bring Alexis into the space, and also to say a little bit about my part in the symbiosis. I think I am a microbiologist by training, microbial ecologist. I study microbes at the bottom of the ocean, microbes in soils, microbes in coastal seagrass meadows, and just spent a lot of time at the microscope. And so this is a really, and these have been very important relationships for me, learning with microbes. And I've been really honored to be with the bottom of the ocean often through my scientific work, and I also am a philosopher of biology and think a lot about interdependence, relationality, about how we sort of deconstructing the idea that we are each intrinsically existing objects or selves. So that's part of my more philosophical writing. Right now, I'm in Santa Cruz, recently started at the University of California, Santa Cruz, so I'm like a country neighbor, I guess, in a way, of the Bay Area, and always happy to make friends here as well. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, y'all. My name is Jeremy Touissaint-Baptiste, and I am y'all. I do not consent to being just myself. I genuinely mean that. I'm y'all. I suppose I'm an artist and performer and professor. I teach sculpture and extended media at Virginia Commonwealth University, which is very new. Before that, I've spent the last 10 or so years just delving into the efficacy and potential of low frequency, frequencies which dip below the threshold of human hearing, as a potential to activate a sort of imaginary that functions beyond what we see or what we hear, something that goes beyond our dominant and sort of typical understanding of our perception and thus the world. And I do that through building large structures and using a lot of low frequency, and putting people in darkness, not as in an effort to make everybody black. That's stupid. As opposed to saying what happens when we get into a space and we can't see or be seen, which means we can't represent or be represented. And what does this do for our potential as beings that are not existing along a sensorial hierarchy, maybe a sense of sensorial relation, but certainly not dominated or marching along through the scopic regime or that of the ocular. And that brought me to spaces and ideas of water memory and thinking about how sound travels faster through water than it does solid and air, and the sort of shit that can get kicked up conceptually or imaginatively when we extend the same consideration around microplastics to the people, civilizations, communities, and the histories which exist in our water sources. Dirty history and clean water is the thing that I'm fixated on right now. Yeah, very happy to be here. Y'all are great. Y'all are great. Y'all are great.
Great. Well, thank you for the introductions. I think, those actually touch upon a lot of my questions I have in terms of, moderating this session, in a sense. But, I was sent, publications and even various notes from discussions before, kind of pre-conference stuff, right? And so, Annika actually has this quote in there. I'll go, "Ancestors are not confined to the past. Their presence and influence are felt in the present, destabilizing linear," can you finish that, Annika? I can't read my handwriting. Temporality, sorry. Yes. But anyway, with the essence of that question, I guess, how do the concepts of space and time play into your work, and how are you attempting to deconstruct standardized notions of time and space in your work through memory? Specific examples, I guess, right?
We're all going to sit here and just nod at each other. That's great. I'm going to start with something. I'm not trying to deconstruct anything, right? Honestly, right? I'm just living a life, and a life that I've been given through history and memory and time and people. And that all comes into a big crazy soup that is nowhere and everywhere all at the same time. So it's just to me it's being, right? And taking that and extending the being from whatever it is to be a embodied person to then a technological entity that sometimes gets referred to as a person. But so time and space collapse in that, right? Or it all comes together, because sometimes we're calling like literal ancestors in a certain way, right? Through their memories, sayings, recordings of what they've done. And sometimes we're calling on things that come from a weird future because they've never been said, but emanate from the things that have been said. Oh, sorry, I'm being so circular. Right? But that kind of back and forth of time, like it doesn't quite make sense to me anymore, which is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I agree. Time doesn't make sense, that's for sure. Like, how's it 5? But in a deeper sense, no, totally. It's and I feel like I one organism ancestor that I think about and with is seagrass, and one story, I have like a couple poems here, but one about seagrass. And the reason I really wanted to bring seagrass into this conversation is because, seagrasses are actually, they're, the evolutionary story that's told through evolutionary biology is like, that algae are, the first photosynthetic organisms originate in the ocean with cyanobacteria and eukaryotes, so that you have algae. Then the algae become land plants, or evolve and give rise to land plants. So then from the ocean to the land, and now there's all these land plants. And then there's like 0.2% of land plants go back to the ocean. And they're like, okay, we want to go back. And I think this is so beautiful and poetic, and I really think of, this is such a major transition to do, like to actually go and be submerged underwater and, with the salt and the elements, and how are you going to make it? And so I think seagrass teaches me a lot about really brave transitions into the unknown and about memory. And I'll read the poem to give you a feeling for what I think seagrass is saying about memory. Lab notes what the seagrass said. You mix up different times where the future is past, where progress is regress, where ancestral is descendant. You loop time in a genome that circles, you interrupt forward and back. Life is not like that, you say, not a linear bursting forth from the Big Bang. Life is on and off, memory and forgetting, a place where things don't get better or worse, but different. And even then, perhaps not that different. The algae within you, the chloroplast genome, the ancient symbionts you hold close to your surface, to touch the living olds, to know them. Intimately inside and indistinguishable from self, still the impulse is to say, I am here, I remember. Remember our kinship, algae and land plant? I'd say remember, there is something called love, there is something called freedom. Tangled tree, remarkable rhizome, freedom. You escaped into water. Escaped? No more airborne pests. Left your former enemies behind, they say. Made a new place, a revolutionary place, a never-before-done deed, a sacred space travel space. You felt ocean and said home. I'd say remember, there is something called love. There is something called freedom. There were problems there too, not things to be solved, just different conditions. How would you speak to each other? You were used to breath and air. How would your embryos find shelter and seed? You had relied on the air currents to carry pollen. How would you find light below the attenuation of water? You were used to the full spectrum, the bright rainbow light, though it aged you with ultraviolet. How would you? How would you? If you had thought it through, you would have never begun. 100 million years ago, you listened to Tony Cade Bambara and said, the most effective way to do it is to do it. You made why into how into now. Tangled the reason with the means, the need with the adaptation, the knowing with the doing, the ancestral with the future, and stepped root first into the ocean. Oh, thanks for this. So seagrass is my memory teacher in terms of it's not just linear, and the ancestors really are now in this way, and I think that that's an amazing teaching. And I want to share one more poem from a more recent ancestor, who is June Jordan, an amazing Black feminist poet, who is also teaching. I'll read the poem, and then I think you'll understand. This is Greensboro, North Carolina, and June Jordan wrote this in 1979. We studying the rule, and I should say that this is from Alexis Pauline Gumbs' dissertation, so I'm bringing Alexis back here, and I should say that refrain, there is something called love, there is something called freedom, is actually a line from Undrowned. So that was in quotation marks when I was reading the poem, so it's like a symbiotic poem in that way. We studying the rule, you can not say death to the clan. You can not say death to the clan. Death to the clan. You cannot say death to the clan. You cannot say a glass of water to a thirsty Black man. You cannot say a glass of water. You cannot say death to the clan. Death to the clan. So June Jordan here is using poetry to say what can't be said. Greensboro, North Carolina in 1979, there's a reference to a massacre that happened in Greensboro because there were basically a group of a demonstration, a nonviolent demonstration of communists who were protesting the Ku Klux Klan, and they were killed by the Klan. And to this day, there hasn't been reparations. There's a Truth and Reconciliation Committee in Greensboro that is trying to get justice around this because it was witnessed by police and no one was actually brought to account. So she's saying you cannot say death to the Klan. You can, and then she uses poetry to say, actually, I'm going to say it through the poem. You cannot say death to the Klan, death to the Klan. And I think June Jordan, like the seagrass, is really brave. And right now, what I need to remember when I think about memory, I think about courage and about how courageous seagrass was and how courageous June Jordan was. And I think to riff on her poem, I feel like today she would say, you cannot say ceasefire in Gaza, ceasefire in Gaza. You cannot say ceasefire in Gaza, ceasefire in Gaza. So I want to use her poem and use the ancestral force of it to say what can't be said today. And to say that there is, that's the way in which the past is not finished. Like, our ancestors are here. And I think this is the way in which, like, courage is like an element that sort of never dies. And I'm always afraid, so it's not like I'm like preaching about courage or something like this. I'm just saying that when I think about ancestors and memory and what I need to know now, it's about how to be brave.
Thank you. It's a complicated. I want to respond to the question directly before meandering and finding my way to what. Yeah, that. Because it all, I think, begs specificity. I'm from South Louisiana, a town called Baton Rouge. I grew up a mile away from the Mississippi River, which, next to the James River, is one of the two major sites of was one of the two most major sites of human trafficking during the transatlantic slave trade, and I grew up a mile away from it, with my family lineage not extending beyond the state of or what we consider to be the state of Louisiana. There are a lot of questions in that. There are also a lot of answers in that. In 1993, I attended a family reunion, the only one I've ever attended. And after the reunion, there was a document which circulated around the family, which my grandmother gave to me a few years ago. 2020 hit, and I had a lot of time to revisit things that I thought that I had read thoroughly, but I didn't read so thoroughly. There were things that I discovered in this document which were beautifully poetic and poetically terrifying. Finding direct links to what might be considered Confederate nobility. So, I want to languish in the ostensible beauty of the ancestors, but that's not a beauty that all of us are afforded when some of them are, those are still ancestors.
Right.
That's still part of what got me into this room for misery and for worse. And that's what we do know. In the text, there are moments where it's like, Cousin Erminy went for a walk, and we didn't see them again. And this is in the 1800s in South Louisiana, Peribellum, around the time of the fall of the Confederacy. And that's a terrifying thought, to think that one of my ancestors took a walk and the nigga was never heard from again. Or it's beautiful that this person took a walk and we don't know what they discovered. And so I think of the thing of the ancestor is not a neutral space, nor is it always a positive one. And sometimes it can be one of outright unknowing. And so when I'm faced with this, I spent 3 months in France trying to find the links between the Acadians who settled in Nova Scotia, who ended up in Acadiana, Louisiana, outside of what would become Lafayette, after it was established as Vermilionville by my great some other grandfather. That's not a flex. I'm embarrassed, right? When I got to France, I did not find the answers. I was faced with, I knew the path, and the pot of gold at the end of the path was a void. And I had the wonderful opportunity to sit and look into that void and not necessarily need to answer the questions. Because if I tried to answer the question, I might find out where Erminy went. And I don't want to know. And that's not about staying ignorant. That's about allowing history to exist in ways that escape our understanding and grasp of it in the now, which means that there might be potential for the future to exist in a way that escapes how we understand it here and now. And in that way, ancestry becomes hauntological, right? To pull in Derrida, it becomes something that potentially the future can remind us of the past and the failings of the present, in the potential trappings of the future and the past and the present and so on. And I think also poetics is something that has been very helpful in not just like poetry, but the idea of looking at reality in a way, or looking at things in a way where maybe they make sense, but like Fred Moten says, words don't go there. But the thing, the affect, the poetic intention, like Glissant would say, is still there. I also like think about Claudia Rankin, a dear collaborator who wrote What Alerts Alters. So I'm different, knowing that these gaps exist, knowing that these people existed, knowing that, I don't need to find the truth of it to have been changed. Yeah. Also, what was it you can't say in Gaza? Ceasefire in Gaza? We can in the United States. Ceasefire in Gaza. I don't care enough about my job to not go out and I facts.
Facts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is kind of that simple.
Right. Thank you.
Something that came up in a talk with us, which I think relates to everything that's come up, is the idea of attention. And how do we give attention to what we don't know, what isn't there, what might be lost? When does memory become obsolescence? Or when does obsolescence funnel back upward into memory?
Right.
The shit can come back.
There's a term. Thank you, first of all, for sharing these amazing stories about your research and how you're thinking about memory. And that's really helpful for me, coming from a discipline, who just always throws stuff at me all the time, to believe it's, not necessarily true where I come from in a lot of ways. And so, and it's really helpful that we're all thinking about these things in these ways that go back to our experiences, right, and who we are as folks. But I guess I want to bring up, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, her research, and she's a historian, but she talks about unforgetting. And, I think, she talks about settler colonialism as a mechanism for us as people, to kind of forget about what actually happened, and that forces these questions of nationalism and these ongoing narratives of things just didn't happen in the past, and how that kind of portrays us into the future. And I don't know if that ties back into what you're talking about, Jeremy, in a sense, in the end, but some of these things we might want to forget are pretty horrible. Some might just need to stay there. We don't have to know that sometimes, but some stuff might help us find that beauty, I guess, in a sense too. And so, for me, coming from my culture, I always try to. There's a tenet I talk about called gojo. It's a one word, but it means beauty, balance, and harmony. And so I try to always guide my research with that notion in my mindset, how can I achieve these levels, at least for the present day community and beyond. And so in that sense, I don't know, thinking about Ortiz's work, thinking about, what Jeremy just said, and how we tie that back into maybe unforgetting. Is that something we need to do? I don't know, I guess that's a question for you guys too.
Who's got that? I've got nothing. So that's okay. But I'm going to let you guys go. I want to talk about the void in a little bit, but I want to let you go.
The void. Okay.
Oh, the void. Yeah.
Unforgetting. I think, yeah. So I struggle. I think that's so what you said, Jeremy, really made me, it's you're sort of talking about this, as I understood it, thinking at that to discover, that relating with the ancestors is a kind of discovery or something, that we're going to go and we're going to discover who they were, and that's the act of unforgetting, and that it's like surprising, and that's true. And I also really appreciate, I had a whole like, literally a group of like South Asian women who we'd have like chai together, and for a year we met like once a month, and we called it the trouble with ancestors. It was like the trouble with ancestors was our whole, because we were like, we are a little troubled, I gotta say, about what that. So yeah, we have like. I really related hard with like that it's not all rainbows, and like what it means to claim difficult ancestors. I think Alexis Shotwell talked about this in Against Purity, about being like, okay, claim the hard ancestors and make that, still keep that in part of memory. And I thought that was, anyways, many people have talked about this. It was just one reference, but yeah, and I just think it's like, sometimes I think of memory as like we're unearthing what we know is already there. So in a way, it reflects the positivist view of science or something, where it's like the object is out there, and we will go and discover it, and it exists as it is, independent of us, what we say about it. And I think in many ways that is important in history to have like common objects, obviously, but it doesn't sort of take into account the way in which like we are such. Like in the present, we are participants in memory, or like that we are doing so much work of like creating what it is right now. Like we are choosing in many ways, like what to remember, what to forget, when to unforget. And there's like real problems with that, like revisionist history. And then there's there's some honesty in saying that the past is actually like, in really looking at what we are, how it is that we are participating in narrating the past, and how, like, what an intense responsibility that is, like, and the massive consequences of narrating the past in a certain way, as we know. So, I mean, I'd love to hear more from you about this, but I mean, from anyone.
I guess the only thing I think is, or my thought is all information good information? I'm an information junkie, so my initial inclination is to say yes, but I also, I don't know if I believe that. I think these moments, these people, these histories are not always pleasant, and maybe there can be an efficacy or a positive consequence to engaging with unforgetting certain things. But I think the question of empathy that came up or the human toll, which I think was implied at the end of the last panel, I think is like, what are we asking in unforgetting, right? Like this space is beautiful and wonderful, and the moment we walk outside, and not because the neighborhood is intense due to socioeconomic factors, but because the world is difficult. What does it mean to ask people to potentially put themselves through something, for cultures, for families, for communities, to put themselves through something that might be uncomfortable, difficult, or potentially harmful for some individuals, knowing that the world doesn't have the ability to show the care that would be needed societally to support such a radical gesture. So like, I want to believe in it, and I'm also like, we need to build a world that can permit for that, that can facilitate that, that can encourage that. Otherwise, we're asking human beings to do a lot of difficult, dirty work that, and why, right? Like, maybe for the self is an important thing, but I don't necessarily always know about excavating knowledges and practices and histories for capital or for anything other than like these. I'm very this driven, but also like responsibility to the history reminds me that I have to like go off these.
How do you think we open it? So if we're talking about excavating histories or thinking about how do we open it up so that okay, if we're thinking about a void, if we're thinking about these histories, and we're thinking about creating a space where they can be recognized, they can be, like, how do you move them from the thing that is maybe derogatory, troubling, to something that is supportive, that one can stand on? And I said one, but I think what I really mean is that we can stand on, right? Collectively, not as these independent moments of, okay, this is what is sustenance for me, right? How do we open it up so that there's that space where we can go there, unforget, look into what is there, right? Use it as a strengthening, a tonic in many ways. And then, right, we're talking backwards a lot. I'm thinking about what that does for a future and how you, I'm going to say apply, but I don't really mean apply in a direct way, but port that into a future space, right? So that one is grounded in a different way, even if the stories are not the ones that, rainbows, like you're saying, right? Or rainbows. Like, if the stories are not rainbows, we still need grounding.
That's right. Yeah. That really sparked a lot. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go
Please
ahead.
talk.
No, go.
I just was like, I think that's so important. And I was just thinking actually to the beginning of the day where Nate opened with this beautiful poem by Mary Oliver and that begins with, "You do not have to be good." And I was like, that's what that's about, like that. If the ancestors, if they weren't perfect, or like they did not have to be good, they did not have to be perfect, they could be like imperfect and flawed and complicated, and like somehow remember, like giving them, sort of freeing them and freeing us in a way of like, it, like that's, I think about this as like one meaning of freedom or liberation. Like we talk about freedom and liberation in many ways, yeah, I could go on for a while, but some part of freedom is like liberating ourselves from our own expectations or something, or liberating others from our conceptions of who they're supposed to be, basically. So it's like a practice of freedom in a way to say, like, this is who, by allowing them to be who they were, like what it does for the future is that it allows us to be like much more vast, I think, with ourselves and who we like. It's not like lowering our expectations. It's saying we actually, we really do need to become like really capacious here. You know what you were saying? Like we have to become like really, really big in order to hold how much like non-virtue or something, like not good there is in the world. And like we have high expectations of ourselves and others. And yeah, so anyways, that's what sparked for me, is that to me it creates like a ground of compassion that's really, really important.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think a lot about compassion as opposed to empathy, and what it means to have compassion and that space for ourselves and one another, and what it means to build a space, right? So thinking a lot about what our dreams are, our true dreams.
Yeah.
Not the ones we've been given,
Right.
not the things we've been told that we're supposed to want or need, or the things we're supposed to stand on, but what is really in there, good, bad, or other,
Right.
right? And then how do you nurture that into being? What does it take to nurture one's truest desires and aims into something? And for me, that's all about a past or time rubbing against each other, the friction of different times, and trying to figure that out, because I feel like we've been given so much that is not necessarily supportive.
Yes.
Right? And then if that's what you're standing on, how do you rearrange it?
Yeah.
In the face of, like, people are talking about capitalism today, right, a lot, and all the other systems that we sit on that often tell us, right, and that we buy, or that we get comfortable in, right? Like, I feel a lot like my generation and a lot of my friends, like, they're so comfortable in certain ways that stuff that goes on in the world, it's hard to get up and do something about it. Because, like, if I get up and do something, I'm going to lose this little grain of sand that I have, as if that grain of sand is something, right? And And like, where do we ride those spaces? Or make even the spaces that people can try to see that for themselves, which is really an interesting question for me. Sorry, we're going in weird ways from that.
No,
Yeah,
it's
okay.
perfect. No, I mean, I think that's the bigger questions. I mean, how do you appreciate these ontologies, right? And, the heartfelt understandings that we have, the gut, the heart, that is tied back to the mind in a lot of ways. And how do we push that forward as, as underpinning everything we do in the face of capitalism, in the face of extraction, in the face of, all these other things that are going on in the world, and that allow, us to really move forward and, with our communities, with our relationships, with our experiences and powerful and effective ways. And I don't know. I mean, that's what I try to do with my own research, and it's really hard for me. I'm going to go back to my archaeology hat right now for a minute, but, I ran this field school for like 2 years, a pseudo field school basically, and we brought in students, contract companies, and tribal folks from where I'm from. It was ran on a reservation. But, I remember like some of the tribal folks there who didn't really have much training in stuff we were doing, but they were like screening artifacts. It's what you do when you excavate, and you put like the whole bucket of soil in there, and you get pottery or whatever out. But all the Apache folks were talking in Apache to these artifacts that have been buried for 1,300 years.
Wow.
And this white lady comes by, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, this is really great. They're really getting it. They really know how to move that thing along." And I was like, "What? I mean, you're not seeing what's going on here, the relationality? I mean, these more than human entities, these pottery sherds, these chipstone are hearing the ancestral language again.
Yeah.
They're being reintroduced, to folks in the contemporary times, and so they've been buried for like 1,300 years, and so."
Wow.
So I think that's a big issue. I mean, just the ongoing kind of notion of, how we assess things, and how, it's all a part of like this a different way of knowing, I guess, the world, right? And through a lot of our experiences. And so I think that's really important. I mean, so I think that talks to a lot of, I think we're trying to get at, right, in a sense, maybe.
Beautiful.
Hopefully.
Definitely. Those different ways of knowing, right? Well, to me, that story tells me about the understanding, right? Or the
Yeah.
ability to understand what's going on in a space, and not being able to step back when you don't, right? Like going into it hard as opposed to observing,
Yeah,
seeing,
exactly.
right?
Yes.
And respecting that relationship. And it's an interesting question, because I'm like, well, if you can't even see the relationship, how do you respect it? And where do we build those spaces, right? Because people often, they just have no clue, right? And it's like, listen, there's something very special in front of your face right in this moment. If you just shut up, sit back, and be able to take it, right? And think about what that is. And you're making me think about true. Like, I think a lot about true these days. Not what a truth is, but what rings true in certain ways, which might ring true to me, but not to you. And how you communicate that to others so that they can at least consider the questions that true brings. But yeah, nothing else with that.
I think something just clicked for me in thinking about what you were saying earlier about how do we maybe take incongruous experiences of time and history and things like that, and maybe allow for less friction or a different type of collision. And I wonder, like you just said, well, you just sit and look, and maybe the incongruence is similarly something that we don't understand. So what happens when we look at time and history's passage on time and history's passage's terms, and either throw ourselves into it or allow ourselves to sit back and keep looking and listening, and thus receiving information from something that we think we get because we have it in books and the internet and quantified knowledge and the record, which supposes itself to be official. And I think also thinking about that person with the grain of sand, we have, as people working in poetics and art and sort of like thought and things that delve into materiality but also extend beyond it, we can go to that person with that grain of, and who only has that one grain of sand and say like, what happens when you turn it that way and now it's a spoon? And just like allowing someone or something to free up its imaginary and to free up what it thinks it knows about a thing, or a time or a thing, could be a really moment. At the same time, something that my students constantly, we're really deep in arguing about it is, can a thing never not be itself? Can history ever not be what it is? Can the past, or can these things ever not be what they are? Which I guess is a question of ontology or the limits of ontology.
Yeah. You're making me think, which history? Like, can which histories be what they are, or which histories be how they are aware, or what, right? And how those calculate? It's like, this is one of my like crazy AI dreams, right?
Sure.
It's that we take the histories that we have. So if history is usually written by the winner, right? And we have multiple histories from around the world, right? And then we analyze them all together, right? Without doing the hard, well, we are going to tell this story. I would love to hear the story that comes out of that, to see if there's anything more true that comes out of it versus whatever truth we are trying to be told about something, often which is not true. Right? Like, how do we, can AI help us see some of those spaces and open up space for us then to study it more particularly as individuals or academics or artists, what have you. Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually my next question along those lines, but I think I got the sign for questions now, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Oh, dang. Come on. We just got started.
Question thought.
So, yes, I guess we'll open it up to the crowd unless you guys have nothing, we can go on to the next question. But
Is Mike coming to you?
Oh, the smell is so nice.
I would love to hear about the void and what you were going to say about that.
I don't know about, the void is just beautiful to me, right? I don't know what I think about the void, but it feels like it's a space to get lost in versus to find things in. And I like the idea of getting lost in whatever something is so that I can, like, I'm going to make myself the AI now. Like, if I'm lost in a void of memory and histories, some great, some not, and I'm swimming in that, will bring back a little swimming. Then I have to come out and do something with that. It's like, what can I bring out of that? And I'm always going to try to bring some kind of beauty out of that in a weird way. So I'm like, well, I feel like I can swim in lots of crap and still come up with beauty, right? And what does it take to do that? Yeah. There are questions.
My question is fumble, but we'll see what happens.
Great.
Thinking that memory is produced right now. Can you tell me any ways that you acknowledge that what's happening in front of you will become a memory for you to keep? Like, what's the signifier that that's something that you want to keep with you and bring back to right now.
Wow. So look at what we're doing. It's really interesting to me because I went, oh, do you mean the embodied kind of memory that just gets stored in ways that I don't have control over? Or the kind that I'm kind of taking snapshots of with my mind and then I will carry and bring them into space in another kind of time? Yeah, I think I prefer the ones where I'm in control, of course. But it's hard to know, right? Like sometimes you'll walk like 6 months later
Right.
and something from this room will hit me in 6 months and I'll go, oh, right. I'll be like, that's why I was there. This is what I'm going to try to do with that. And how am I going to spin it, right, out into something new? So for me, it's an open process that I try to let shower over and see how it's acting, because I trust it's all acting on, upon, and around me. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd also just quickly add, like, I think that this is, yeah, it's definitely like, I guess this question for me sparks more on the collective level in a way, that it is like, yeah, like what do I choose to remember? And I agree with you that like often it's something, it's like sense, you know what I mean? Like when you smell something and then involuntarily you're like, wait, I didn't even know I remembered that somewhere. So I'm glad we're doing scent here. So sometimes I'm not sure exactly what I'm choosing to remember, to store, or to recall per se. But I think in terms of the collective, I feel like there's a lot of decisions to be made, like a lot of discernment, a lot of soul searching, a lot of political work, a lot of, like we actually have to come together and sort of really decide and discern what we remember, like what counts as important about today, tomorrow. And we don't always have that, like, because there's so few democratic spaces, period, like in the sense of like places where people actually come together in order to make really big decisions about our world and how it's going to go. And I mean this for science and technology, there's like basically no political entity, like no polity, no group that can even decide what a just science is. Like, so we talk about like, my new role is about science and justice. I'm like, we don't even have the means of deciding what that would be, and to make those decisions together in an ethical way. And so this is a big it's like about political imagination, et cetera. But in a similar way, like I think like imagining even the space, even the community that could come together to think about history and memory and deciding together what we remember, I think I'll put that out there as like something for us to imagine together, because I don't think it exists yet. But I like to imagine that in the future or something that we will have ways of deciding in a more ethical and collective way how to remember.
I think that the social aspect of it feels really important to me. I don't trust what I see, hear, or say. I don't. I also don't trust what y'all see, hear, or say on your own. It's when we talk about what happened in this room that I gain an understanding of what happened in this room. And that's still not a representation, or it's not the thing, right? So I'm also thinking about what is memory? Like recalling of information, sure, but talking about a shared experience where we can all talk about what we experienced and what happened, but we didn't even experience it all the same, nor as the same people as we're doing it as individuals. So to me, it just like, again, glissant and relation becomes really important, and also not needing to have the total picture. I like to think of art as being able to keep a secret. I like to think of things as being able to keep secrets. So what happens when this moment is able to keep its own secret and escapes, that was an awful sound, escapes memory, and in that way, like, breathes life into the thing after it happens. Like, we can keep talking about it, but I don't remember what I did an hour ago. And I don't want to.
Right.
You know?
Keep a secret. Beautiful.
I appreciate the distrust. I did come up with a question. You know, in all memory, we're filled with warnings. Don't touch that. Don't go there. And now we have this warning that let's not trust this AI. So I don't trust that. I'm just asking a question. Do you foresee the possibility of things they're warning us about could be the tool of insurgency we need to overcome some of the difficulties that we are living in?
This one's for you.
I completely think that some of the things that they're warning us about could be that tool. We're constantly warded off of the things that might be helpful to us. I run the line that I've talked to 5-year-olds who have told me how bad AI is and how all robots are going to kill us. But that's the story we tell ourselves through the media that we watch. They're watching like even Disney movies that are telling them that. So we're already telling ourselves what our relationship to the technologies are supposed to be and how we're supposed to fear them. And I choose to think about what our relationship to the technology could be. And even though there are layers of problems, what we as groups of individuals and groups of collectives might imagine into it to do something other. And that, we live in a time where us doing something is really possible. Like, it's possible. And so I hope that we all try, right? Like, that's the idea. It's like, go and see what you can do with it, because we're at a moment where things are fluid. And if we leave the power of that fluidity to the companies, we know what we're getting. If we go in and work with it and see what we can do with it, hey, there's a chance that something very different comes out of that. So, please go play with AI or whatever the next thing is, because I hear that all the generative stuff is going down the toilet in the next 5 years, right? So that's the trajectory that experts are saying. We'll be onto something next, bigger. And what is that? But if we're always reforming our world in that way, that's kind of exciting. Or you're giving me the crazy face, right? I love it. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for this. And this question maybe is a little selfish because I would love to get your thoughts on this, partly for a personal project. But some of my research is thinking about centering, for lack of a better word, ontologies and what we each hold true. And what's really interesting is that when we speak about theory, it's often very pure, how we treat ontologies, and in reality, we're all hybrids. Globalization has really, contaminated different ways of seeing the world, and not in a negative way, but just in a hybrid way. So as in this project, I'm thinking about what does it look like to hold collective spaces for collectively imagining other ontologies that are not what the current status quo is. And I think we each hold bits of those alternative ontologies in our own realities. But the task and the challenge, I think, is to surface what are those. Because, like you said, some of those are so inherent to our truth that we don't see them. And maybe it's more important than ever, talking about memory, to bring some of those back to our collective attention, to preserve them, because maybe, in a dystopian world, all of our memory is going to be whatever is captured in generative AI models and anything that's not on there, including a lot of the oral histories are, not going to be captured. So what does it look like for, methods-wise? And I think about storytelling as like the first one to go to, and that's some of what I'm working with. But do you have ideas for what does it look like to try and surface these bits of unique ontological ideas that we hold, each of us, so intuitively that we don't even think about them? How can we collectively surface some of those so we can hold on to them and cherish them?
I think my thing is, let's argue about it. I think having individuals or groups discussing competing or variously layered ontologies at the same time begs conflict and begs unpacking some shit. And in that way, it's not like the march out of the cave towards the light. It's like, ooh, let's turn around and go back into the cave and bump into one another. Right. Let's bump into a wall and really consider the nature of the wall.
Yeah.
We don't see it. I can't tell you what I'm seeing, or da 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 da. You can't tell me what you're seeing, but we're touching this thing. Now we potentially have a very different understanding of what this thing could be from even an ontological or untological journey in. That's how I try and get there. Also knowing that someone's going to be Bartleby and say, I would prefer not to engage in this exercise, and the thing cannot ever be anything other than what it is, and how to hold space for the argument, but also the challenge, the arguing, but also the challenge to the arguing that attempts to pull things back into a very necessarily crude immediacy.
Yeah, what you said. I mean, yeah, I think a lot of that. And then I'm being lazy. But also, yeah, and it sparked also for me this, like what Devaki said as an opening poem, you know, like in order to hear the birds, the bombs have to stop. I really kept that beautiful phrase from a Palestinian poet that you brought up earlier today. Yeah, in order to hear the birds, the bombs have to stop. And I think that's like what I get so much from that phrase in this moment, but also from like thinking about what you were saying about dreams, what you're saying about ontology, like there actually have to be quiet spaces where like we are not constantly being manipulated and constantly being like told what we desire, like manipulated through our desire, through our technologies. Like we don't even know what we want sometimes because it's like somebody's always telling us what we want. And they're very good. Like they're very well funded and they're really well researched, like the ways in which our, you know, it's like we think we want this because people have been paid to tell us we want this. In a way, I'm not trying to be conspiratorial. I just mean like turning our attention to what we actually want is really difficult. And it's like a resting away. And then not, like in terms of unearthing ontologies, it's like the part that's the ontologies that have drowned out other ontologies actually have to be quiet. And like we have to sort of make them a little bit more quiet, you know, somehow. Like Vanessa Watts in her piece Indigenous Place thought, and this makes me think of why your work is so important too. She's saying like, science has made indigenous people stand in disbelief of themselves, right? She said literally, stand in disbelief of ourselves. And so in order to not stand in disbelief of ourselves, something has to like you said, take a step back, be a little quiet. And it has to happen within us as well, something like that.
Yeah.
So.
And I will add, I've like all the work I do with technology, I've come up with our stories or our algorithms. We've been running them for millennia. Right? And if we keep those stories alive in the way that you're saying, right, they're there to support us. And then I will go to the idea of gifting, right? Like of gifting, and this is gonna maybe sound odd, gifting the technology, the things that we feel are so important that it needs to know, right? Like that's sort of my stance. I'm kind of giving up a lot of family lore and things, but I think it's stuff that technological ecosphere needs to know and is so poorer without, so willing to push that through. And I wonder what happens if we kind of make that weird effort. I know we're told all the time, don't give up your data, don't tell your data. But if we withhold, the other ontologies win, right? Like, but if we bombard them with the things that we think are important, there's something in there that's deeper. And maybe they can even see all the things that they've erased over time, right? Because we are reinserting them again and again.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that's the end of time, and so thank everybody.
Beautiful.